Padre Pio told a man standing before him in San Giovanni Rotondo with perfect calm that he had 18 months to live. Not because of illness, not because Padre Pio had seen a physical condition in his body, but because of something he saw in the structure of the man's soul. "You have 18 months, Padre Pio said, to pay what you owe. Not to me, not to God. To the men whose work you took without giving back what was due, and to the man whose future you took when he trusted you." The man went white. He had told no one in the world what he had done. He had convinced himself over 20 years of genuinely faithful Catholic practice that it was complicated, that the circumstances had been unusual, that there were reasons, that God would understand. Padre Pio looked at him a moment longer, and then said something that the witnesses to that conversation recorded and that the friars preserved in the collection of testimonies gathered for his beatification. "He does understand. That is precisely why I am telling you now. I've been attending Mass since I was 4 years old, and I have to say this honestly. It took me until my late 40s to understand that there are two entirely separate accounts a soul carries through life. The first is the account between you and God. The sins confessed, the graces received, the ongoing conversation of the interior life. The second is the account between you and the people around you. What you owe them for specific actions, what was taken without being returned, what was damaged without being repaired. Padre Pio understood something that most modern Catholic preaching rarely addresses with any precision. These two accounts are not the same thing, and what happens to the soul that arrives at death with the second account still open is what today's video is about. There is a question that sits quietly in the minds of most practicing Catholics, and almost no one asks it out loud in church. It is this: when someone you love dies, a parent, a spouse, a friend who was genuinely devout, who went to Mass and said their prayers and tried to live a good Catholic life, but who also, in their business dealings, in their financial history, in the private corners of their relationship with money and with other people, carried things they never fully resolved. What happens? Not to their sins. You know what the Church teaches about sins confessed and forgiven, but to the specific injustices, the wages not paid fairly, the partnership exploited, the inheritance arranged in a way that quietly disadvantaged one sibling, the loan never repaid, the contractor underpaid, the employee dismissed without what was owed. The small, incremental, quiet accumulation of taking a little more than what was due and giving a little less than what was deserved, over years, over decades, in ways that never looked like crime and never registered as serious sin because they were always dressed in the language of business, of practicality, of everyone doing the same thing. What happens to that account? Padre Pio knew. He had seen it in souls. He had sat with widows and children asking about the spiritual state of men who had been good Catholics and imperfect distributors of justice in equal measure. And the answer he gave was more precise, more specific, and more ultimately hopeful than most Catholics expect. Stay with me, because there is a mechanism at work here that the Church has always taught, but rarely explains this clearly. And there is a prayer at the end of this video that I believe is one of the most practically powerful things a living Catholic can do for a deceased parent, spouse, or relative who carried this kind of unresolved account. To understand what Padre Pio taught about financial injustice and the soul after death, you need to understand the distinction that Catholic moral theology makes between two entirely different kinds of spiritual obligation. The first is what theologians call the debt of punishment, the temporal consequences of sin that remain after the sin has been forgiven through confession and absolution. This is the debt that Purgatory addresses. When a sin is confessed, God forgives the guilt. But the tendency toward that sin and the disorder it introduced into the soul still requires purification. This is what Purgatory is, not further punishment for forgiven sins, but the ongoing purification of the soul that was shaped over years by patterns of sin that left their mark even after forgiveness. This debt can be reduced by indulgences, by suffrages, the prayers, masses, and charitable acts offered on behalf of the dead. The second kind of obligation is categorically different. Catholic theology calls it the debt of justice, what is owed to other people because of specific acts of injustice. This is not a sin against God in the abstract. It is a wrong done to a specific human being, a wrong that created a specific injury to a specific person, an injury that in justice requires repair. And the critical point, the point that Padre Pio repeated consistently and that the Church's moral tradition is quite clear about, is that the sacrament of confession does not by itself dissolve the debt of justice. Confession restores the relationship between the soul and God. It does not restore what was taken from another person. That restoration requires restitution, the returning of what was taken, or its equivalent, or the best approximation of it that is available. And if a person dies before making that restitution, the debt does not simply disappear. The soul carries it. Not as an unreachable burden, the Church teaches that the debt can still be addressed through the prayers and acts of the living, but as a real, specific weight that affects the quality and duration of the soul's purgatory in ways that are proportional to the damage that was caused. This is not a fringe theological opinion. It is standard Catholic moral theology, found in the Catechism, in the writings of Thomas Aquinas, in the pastoral tradition of every major Catholic confessor for centuries. What Padre Pio added to this established framework was the precision of a man who had actually seen it, who had read souls carrying this weight, and who described, with the specificity that characterized everything about his spiritual gifts, exactly how the mechanism works in the soul of the person who has died with justice unresolved. There is a question that comes up every time this teaching is discussed among serious Catholics, and I want to address it directly before we go further, because avoiding it would be dishonest. The question is, does God not simply forgive all of this at death? Is not His mercy sufficient to dissolve every obligation, including the debts of justice? The answer is nuanced, and it is important to get it right. God's mercy is infinite. It is not limited by the category of sin or the nature of the obligation. What God's mercy provides is the forgiveness of guilt, the restoration of the relationship between the soul and God that was broken by the injustice. That forgiveness is real, and it is given through the sacrament of penance when the soul sincerely confesses and repents. But Catholic moral theology has always insisted on a crucial distinction. The forgiveness of sin does not cancel the obligation to repair the damage that sin caused. Thomas Aquinas put it this way: if a man steals another man's coat and then goes to confession, God forgives the stealing. But the man still owes his neighbor the coat. The absolution covers the relationship between the man and God. It does not cover the missing coat. If the man dies before returning the coat, the soul may be in God's mercy, but the coat is still gone. The justice of God, which is inseparable from His mercy, does not simply dissolve what was owed simply because the person died. It requires, in the spiritual order, that what was taken be in some form accounted for, through purgatory, through the suffrages of the living, through restitution made by descendants. This is not a harsh doctrine. It is actually a profoundly dignified one. It insists that other human beings are real, that what was done to them was real, and that reality does not disappear because someone died. Padre Pio, who had seen this in the souls he read, taught it with this same combination of firmness and mercy. The obligation is real, and it can still be addressed, and the mercy of God is present throughout the process. It is not a condemnation. It is a call to continue the work that death interrupted. Hold on, because in a moment I'm going to tell you what happened with the man Padre Pio gave 18 months, and what happened when his widow came to ask about his soul after he died. But first, you need to understand one more piece of the spiritual mechanism, because it changes everything about what is possible for people still living, both for those of you who carry unresolved obligations of your own, and for those of you whose parents or relatives carried obligations that they never resolved in their lifetimes. Padre Pio described the debt of justice as operating in the soul after death in two distinct layers. He described this to Father Benedetto in a letter, and also to several people directly in pastoral conversations that were recorded in testimony. The first layer he called the material debt, simply the value of what was taken or withheld, a sum of money that was owed but not paid, services extracted but not compensated fairly, goods taken or property misused. This layer has a quantifiable equivalent, at least in principle. It is something that descendants can potentially address through charitable acts, through financial restitution to the families of those wronged, through donations made with the specific intention of repairing what a parent or grandparent took. The Church permits this, has always permitted this, because the doctrine of the communion of saints means that the spiritual acts of the living can genuinely benefit the dead. But Padre Pio described a second layer that he considered more significant and far more rarely addressed. He called it the debt of dignity. And this is the piece that surprises most people who encounter it. Every act of financial injustice, Padre Pio taught, contains within it not just a material element, but a statement about the humanity of the person wronged. When you systematically underpay workers, you are not merely keeping money you owe. You are communicating by your actions that the work of those people, and implicitly the people themselves, is worth less than it actually is. When you exploit a business partner's trust, you are not merely taking an advantage. You are treating that person as an instrument for your purposes rather than as a human being worthy of respect. And that relational dimension of the injustice, the implicit statement about the dignity of the person wronged, cannot be repaired by money alone. This is the hidden connection that Padre Pio revealed to those who came to him with questions about deceased relatives. The soul carrying a debt of justice suffers in purgatory, not only for the material value of what was taken, but for the broken relationship, the damaged recognition of another person's full humanity that the injustice represented. And the most powerful thing that can address that second layer is not money. It is prayer, specifically the prayer of the people who were wronged, offered voluntarily, freely, for the soul of the one who wronged them. And if those people are no longer living, then the prayer of their descendants. A single decade of the Rosary, offered by the family of a man who was wronged by someone now dead, offered specifically for the soul of that person, has, according to what Padre Pio described, a power that no ordinary suffrages can replicate, because it represents the very thing the injustice destroyed, the recognition across the distance of death that the soul of the wrongdoer is still worth praying for, that their humanity, however imperfectly exercised in life, is still held in dignity by those they failed. Before I describe what happened when Padre Pio told Domenico he had 18 months, I want to give you the fuller picture of that encounter, because the details matter. Domenico had come to San Giovanni Rotondo not expecting what he received. He had come, as many devout Catholics came, with a mixture of genuine devotion and a vague hope that the proximity of a saint might somehow confer a general spiritual improvement on his life without requiring him to excavate anything specific. He had been to confession with his parish priest in Bari the week before the journey, as he usually did before any important spiritual event. He had confessed the things he usually confessed. He had said his penance. He arrived at San Giovanni Rotondo with the clean, organized feeling of a man who has prepared. He waited in line to make his confession to Padre Pio. 3 days, as was common, and when he finally entered the confessional, he began as he always began, with the smaller sins, presented in their accustomed order, the pride, the impatience, the failures of charity in the ordinary run of family life. He had not yet reached the financial matters. He had planned not to, at least not in their full reality, when Padre Pio stopped him. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't accuse. He said, in the darkness of the confessional, in a tone that the testimony records as very quiet and very direct, "There is something else. You have been here 3 days. You have been praying for 3 days, and you know what you have not said. I will not hear the rest until you say it." Domenico sat in silence for several minutes. The friar outside could hear nothing. Then apparently Domenico began to speak in a different register than he had used before. He spoke for a long time. When he came out, his face was, as Brother Francesco recorded, the face of a man who has been carrying something for 20 years and has put it down for the first time, not with relief, but with the sudden shock of realizing how heavy it was. The man Padre Pio gave 18 months was named Domenico Ferrara. He was 58 years old, a merchant from Bari, the kind of man who wore his faith on his sleeve and his injustice in the fine print of his business contracts. He had spent 20 years systematically underpaying a rotating group of seasonal agricultural workers who came each harvest to the properties he managed, always at the lower edge of what he could justify, always with the efficiency of a man who knew exactly how much he could extract before the workers would have grounds to complain. He had also, 15 years before his visit to San Giovanni Rotondo, used confidential financial information he had obtained during a brief business partnership with a man named Giacomo Rutiliano to establish a competing operation that destroyed Giacomo's livelihood within 3 years. Giacomo had moved his family to Naples, found eventually a modest clerical job, and had not spoken to Domenico since. Padre Pio told Domenico he had 18 months. Domenico went home and spent the next several weeks in a kind of quiet paralysis. He knew what Padre Pio had referred to. He had always known. He had simply arranged his knowledge so that it remained in a corner of his interior life he did not visit often. He went to his parish priest, not Padre Pio, his ordinary confessor, and made a full confession. His priest gave him absolution, and Domenico felt, as he described to his wife Rosa that evening, lighter in one way and heavier in another. The confession had addressed his relationship with God, but he understood, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, that it had done nothing for the actual accounts. He went back to his records. He calculated as precisely as he could the amount he had underpaid over 20 years. The number was larger than he had admitted to himself. He set aside a sum, not the full amount. He could not manage the full amount without serious consequences to his own family's financial position, and distributed it through a charitable foundation with the explicit direction that it support agricultural workers in the region. He attempted to contact Giacomo Rutiliano. The address he had was 20 years old. He traced Giacomo to Naples through a business contact, wrote a letter, and received no reply. He wrote a second letter. No reply. He told Rosa, "I don't know if he received them. I don't know if he ever will." Domenico died 16 months after his visit to Padre Pio, not dramatically. A sudden cardiac event at home, having just returned from Sunday Mass. He was found by Rosa with his rosary in his hand, which he had apparently taken out in the taxi on the way home. He had not completed the 18 months. He had not resolved everything. The worker's account was partially addressed. The Giacomo account was still formally open, the letters unanswered, the relationship unacknowledged by the man who had been wronged. Rosa Ferrara came to San Giovanni Rotondo 6 weeks after Domenico's death. She had traveled from Bari alone, without telling her children where she was going. She waited in line for 3 days. When she finally reached Padre Pio, she asked only one thing: "Where is my husband?" Padre Pio looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "He is not lost. He is working." Rosa asked what that meant. Padre Pio said, "There is a man in Naples who has not yet forgiven him. There are families in the countryside who have not yet been told that an error was made and an acknowledgement is owed. Until those things find some form of resolution, the account remains open. The account being open is not damnation. It is the natural condition of a soul that died in the middle of a process it had not yet completed." Rosa was quiet. Then she asked, "Can I do something?" And Padre Pio said, "Yes, but it is not what you expect." What Padre Pio told Rosa to do first was not to find Giacomo and offer money. It was to find Giacomo's family and ask them to pray for Domenico, not to apologize on Domenico's behalf, not to make a financial offer. That was secondary. The primary request was the prayer. "Ask them to offer 1 rosary for his soul," Padre Pio said. "If they agree, it will do more for him than everything else combined. If they refuse, that is between them and God. But the asking is the part that Domenico cannot do from where he is. You can do it for him." Rosa was astonished. She had come prepared to offer money. She had expected to be told to pay a sum, have masses said, arrange donations. She had not expected to be told to ask the people her husband had wronged to pray for him. She told the friars in the testimony she gave for the beatification process that she sat with this instruction for several months before she was able to act on it. It felt too exposed, too honest. It required going to strangers and saying, in effect, "My husband wronged your father, and I am asking you to pray for the soul of the man who did that." She told Padre Pio in a subsequent letter that she was afraid of how they would receive her. He wrote back, and the letter is preserved in the archive. 3 sentences. "The asking requires more humility than the paying. That is why it is more effective. The soul your husband damaged was a person, not a transaction. Treating it as a person now, even after death, is itself the repair." Rosa found the families. She found descendants of 6 of the agricultural workers her husband had underpaid consistently. She explained simply what had happened. She gave each family a sum of money, not the full calculated amount, but a genuine portion, offered with a specific acknowledgement that it represented something owed rather than charity given. And to each family, she made the request that Padre Pio had instructed, that they offer 1 rosary for Domenico's soul. 3 families declined to pray. They accepted the money and declined the prayer request. 2 families prayed without being asked before Rosa had finished speaking. One family, the grandson of a man named Fortunato, an elderly worker who had harvested grapes for Domenico every autumn for 12 years, sat in silence for several minutes and then said, "My grandfather said that man was not a bad man. He said he was a man who forgot that we were people. I will pray for him." Rosa wept. She found the same pattern, varying responses, among the people connected to Giacomo Rutigliano, whom she eventually located in Naples through persistent inquiry. She came to Padre Pio a final time several years later and told him what had happened. He listened to the account and then said something that the friar who was present recorded verbatim. "The one prayer of Fortunato's grandson is worth more for your husband than the 1,000 masses said for him by people who never knew him. Because that prayer crossed a wound, and wounds require specific medicine. This reminds me of something I heard many years ago from a priest I respected greatly, Father Declan, who worked as a hospital chaplain in Birmingham and who had spent decades sitting with people in their final days. He told me once that in all his years of that work, the deathbed conversations that were most peaceful were always the ones where the dying person had, at some point in their life, gone back to someone they had wronged and made it right. Not always dramatically. Sometimes just a phone call, sometimes just a letter, sometimes just a conversation that said, "I know I did this and I am sorry, and if there is anything I can do, tell me." He said the people who had never made that kind of approach, who had convinced themselves that confession was enough, that God had forgiven it, that the people involved had probably forgotten anyway, those were often the people who were most restless in their final hours, most troubled by things they couldn't name but also couldn't leave behind. He said, "The body forgets, the soul doesn't." Padre Pio would have recognized that observation entirely. I want to pause on that phrase for a moment. That prayer crossed a wound, what Padre Pio was describing. The hidden connection between the specific injustice done to a specific person and the specific healing available through the prayer of that person's descendants is something that the Church has always understood implicitly, but rarely articulates with this kind of pastoral precision. The doctrine of the communion of saints means that the prayers of the living reach the dead. The teaching on restitution means that the living can act on behalf of the dead to address obligations they left unresolved. But what Padre Pio added was this specific insight. When the prayer comes from the people who were wounded by the injustice, it carries a quality that no other prayer can replicate. Not because God is swayed by the identity of the intercessor in some mechanistic way, but because that specific prayer represents the restoration of something the injustice destroyed, the recognition of a human being's full worth by the person whose worth was diminished. When Fortunato's grandson prayed for Domenico, he was doing something that repaired, in the spiritual order, the exact thing that had been broken. He was saying, in effect, the man who treated my grandfather as less than fully human is still himself fully human, still worth praying for, still held in dignity by the family his actions disrespected. That act of recognition, freely given, not required, genuinely costly in its own small way, is what Padre Pio called the specific medicine for the specific wound. And it is available to every living Catholic who has a deceased parent, grandparent, spouse, or relative who died with this kind of account unresolved. This is what I've been sitting with as I've prepared this video, and I need to share it honestly. My father was a man of great faith and considerable practical imperfection in the arena of money. He died when I was in my 50s, and I knew, without knowing the details, that there were people in his working life to whom things were owed, not dramatically, but genuinely. He was a man who, in business dealings, could be quietly, cleverly unfair in ways that never looked like crime and never registered to him as serious sin. He went to confession regularly. I believe his relationship with God was real, but I also know that he left things unaddressed. And it was years after his death, reading accounts like the one I've just shared with you, that I understood what I could still do. I found one family, I will not go into details, and I made an acknowledgement and an offer, not large enough probably, but genuine. And I asked, as Padre Pio had instructed Rosa to ask, and the person I asked, elderly, surprised, a little formal about it, said, "I will say a rosary for him." I drove home and I cried for most of the journey, not from grief exactly, from something more like relief. The sense that a door that had been standing ajar for 20 years had finally been gently pushed shut from the inside. You have just spent time with some of the most practically significant teaching in Padre Pio's entire pastoral ministry. Teaching that has direct application not just to the dead, but to every person still alive who carries any version of the obligation Domenico Ferrara carried. If this video has given you something real, something that changes how you see your own financial history, your obligations to others, or your capacity to help those who died before they could act, then please consider using the Super Thanks button below. It keeps this work going. It keeps these accounts being documented. And it is itself a small act of the kind of recognition this video is about, saying that things of genuine value deserve to be supported, and that the people who do this work deserve what is owed them for it. So here is what I want to give you before I go. Not a general encouragement to be fair in business. You know that already. Something much more specific. 3 things. First, for those of you who are still living and who carry in whatever form unresolved obligations to other people, financial, relational, material, I want to give you the prayer that Padre Pio recommended for exactly this situation. Not as a substitute for actually making restitution. Making restitution wherever it is possible is not optional, but as the daily prayer of a soul that is choosing to face what it owes rather than protect itself from knowing it. The prayer is this: Lord, show me what I owe and give me the courage to pay it, not later. Now, while there is still time. Let the debt of justice be settled in my lifetime and protect me from the particular foolishness of believing that confession alone is enough when something specific is owed to a specific person. Give me the precision to know what I owe and the humility to pay it. Pray this daily, specifically, not as a vague petition for financial virtue, but as a genuine request for the knowledge of what specific obligations you are carrying and what specific actions are available to you. Second, for those of you whose parents, spouses, or relatives died with this kind of account unresolved, if you know or suspect that someone you loved died with financial injustices they never repaired, you can act for them. Start with what you know. If you know specific people or families who were wronged, begin there, not necessarily with money as the first step, with the acknowledgement. My father did this. I believe it caused you harm. I'm sorry that I cannot undo it, but I want to acknowledge it, and I'm asking if you would be willing to pray for his soul. If that is impossible because too much time has passed and the people are gone, offer the mass intentions for both, for your relative and for those they wronged, with the specific intention of addressing whatever debt remains in the spiritual order. Padre Pio said this works. The Church teaches that it works. Trust it. Third, for those of you who are here because you are worried about someone already gone and wonder if there is still hope, the answer is the same one Padre Pio gave Rosa. The account being open is not damnation. It is the natural condition of a soul in the middle of a process. The process continues, and your prayer, your restitution, your acknowledgement can advance that process. The mercy of God does not stop at the moment of death. The communion of saints is real. What you do here reaches there. Begin. Do not wait for certainty about what is owed or who should receive it. Begin with what you know and trust that the rest will become clear as you move. I want to close with one last thing that Padre Pio said in this context, and that I believe is the most important sentence in this entire video. When Rosa came to him the final time, after she had completed everything she could complete, the acknowledgements, the financial portions, the requests for prayer, and she reported to him all that had happened, including the 3 families who refused and the family of Fortunato's grandson who agreed. She asked him, "Is it enough? Is what I have done enough?" Padre Pio looked at her and said, "Enough is not the right question. The right question is, did you do what was available to you? If you did, then what remains is between God and Domenico, and God is more generous than either of you deserve." Rosa told the friars that she wept at that, not from sadness, but from something she described as a very specific kind of peace, the peace of not being responsible for the final outcome, only for the available action. That distinction between being responsible for the available action and not being responsible for the final outcome is what I want to leave with you today. What this teaching gives me every time I return to it is something I think a great many Catholics desperately need: a sense that the story is not over when someone dies, that there is still something to be done, that love is not rendered impotent by death, that justice is not sealed forever by the last breath, that the obligations of the living toward the dead and of the dead toward those they wronged are still, in the mercy of God, open to movement. Padre Pio understood this because he had seen it in the souls he read, in the grief of the people who came to him asking about those they had lost, in the specific instructions he gave that, case by case, opened possibilities that the grieving had not thought existed. The debt follows the soul, but the debt can be addressed, and it can be addressed by you today for someone who could not address it themselves. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most powerful acts of love available to a living Catholic. Use it.